A few days ago, an exchange of prisoners was announced between Russia and Belarus on one side, and on the other, the US and some other European countries, including Germany. 16 prisoners were released by Russia and Belarus, including several journalists and political activists, but also one or two other people, such as the German tourist who had spent the last 6 months in custody without trial and was facing up to 7 years in prison after attempting to enter Russia with 6 gummy bears allegedly laced with cannabis. The famous dissident Alexei Navalny was supposed to have been included in this number, but of course he died before the exchange could be organized. In return, the other countries released a total of 8 prisoners, almost all of them convicted of offences relating to espionage. This is the biggest exchange of prisoners since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and you might think that the Western countries got the better part of the deal, as they got twice as many prisoners as they released. However, there is a fly in the ointment. One of the prisoners released by Germany was Vadim Nikolaevich Krasikov, more widely known as the Tiergarten murderer, because he wasn't just a spy. German courts found that he was in fact a hitman working for the Russian intelligence agency, the FSB. His target was an ethnic Chechen born in the country of Georgia, whose name in Russian was Zelimkham Sultanovich Khangoshvili. He was wanted by the Russian authorities as a terrorist after he had helped Georgian intelligence identify Russian spies, and also headed up a military unit which apparently was never actually deployed. After several attempts on his life, Khangoshvili travelled to Germany and applied for political asylum in 2016. He lived under an assumed name in Berlin, together with his wife and 4 children. He was concerned that the assassination attempts had been organised by the Russian government, something that the Russians consistently denied. In 2019, a tourist using a passport issued in the name of Vadim Sokolov arrived in Paris, travelled to Warsaw, and then from there to Berlin. On the 23rd of August of that year, around midday, Khangoshvili was walking home from the mosque that he'd been attending through the Kleiner Tiergarten Park in the locality of Tiergarten. He was followed by a man on a bike, who then shot him twice from behind with a pistol fitted with a suppressor before walking up to him and shooting him in the head. And because this is not a James Bond movie and you can't just assassinate somebody in broad daylight in the middle of a big city without somebody noticing, he was seen throwing his disguised bike and gun into the river and arrested very shortly after that. His passport was technically valid, but it had been issued without biometric data, and it had a number that indicated it was possibly issued to an undercover intelligence agent. Now, although both the accused and the Russian government insisted that the man's name was Sokolov, the German investigation very quickly identified him as Krasikov and connected him with a very similar killing in Moscow a few years previously. Perhaps the most important witness at the trial was a Ukrainian man whose wife's sister happened to be married to Krasikov. He travelled all the way from Kharkiv to identify him, and then in court said that he couldn't be sure, and then flew home. But then he asked if he could testify a second time and returned to Berlin. Why had he previously refused to identify the suspect? Because in the courtroom he had suddenly become afraid that he might himself become a target. Why was he prepared to do so now? Well, because he'd come to realize that one way or another, this was going to end in tragedy, so he might as well do the right thing. He not only said that he could identify the suspect, but produced family photos that very clearly showed him, and most damning of all, his distinctive tattoo. You'd think that if there's one thing an intelligence agency might avoid doing, it would be hiring hitmen with massive tattoos on their arms, but maybe there just weren't that many applicants for the job. In the event, Krasikov was sentenced to life, and given the nature of his crime, there was pretty much no prospect of an early release. Russia, predictably, continued to maintain that the man the Germans had imprisoned was Sokolov and had no connection whatever with Russian intelligence. This, they complained, was a political act, a show trial. Now that Krasikov has been released, Russia has triumphantly announced that he is indeed Krasikov and he is indeed an FSB agent, which is basically the diplomatic equivalent of saying, "Bah ha ha, tricked you, you've just given us back our assassin." And this leaves a very nasty taste, neatly summed up in Amnesty International's reaction. On the one hand, we can be very thankful that so many political prisoners, whose only crime was to write some unwelcome news articles, have been released. On the other hand, we had to release a cold-blooded murderer who had been found guilty in a fair trial. Essentially, if we catch a Russian spy executing a dissident in our streets, all Russia has to do is to collect enough journalists and tourists to buy them back. And I personally don't even know what I'm supposed to feel about this whole story. It was followed by a man Why had he previously refused to identify the he lived in Berlin under an assumed name together with his life.